The dirt road leading into the labor camp outside Ventura, California, stretched through barren fields that reflected the agricultural collapse devastating the state during the winter of 1932, and Jesus Ramirez walked that road beside his father, carrying everything they owned in two cloth bundles that weighed almost nothing because they owned almost nothing. At 14 years old, Jesus was small for his age, standing barely 5 feet tall with the slight build of someone whose childhood had been marked by inadequate nutrition and physical labor that stunted growth rather than promoting it. His clothes were patched and faded, his shoes were leather remnants held together with wire, and his face bore the serious expression of children who had been forced to become adults too quickly. His father, Miguel, walked with the heavy gait of a man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. A farmer whose land in Michoacán had failed during Mexico's own agricultural crisis, forcing him north in search of any work that would keep his family from starving. They were among thousands of Mexican families flooding into California during the early Depression years, desperate people seeking survival in a state that increasingly viewed them as invaders rather than workers. The labor camp where they would live consisted of 40 canvas tents erected in rows on land that belonged to a citrus cooperative employing migrant workers during harvest seasons, and the conditions reflected how completely agricultural corporations valued their laborers. Each tent housed between 6 and 8 people, with no privacy, no insulation from heat or cold, and no facilities beyond communal latrines that were rarely cleaned. Water came from a single spigot that served the entire camp, creating lines every morning and evening as families waited to fill containers for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. The camp's residents were almost entirely Mexican families who had arrived seeking the agricultural work that California had once offered abundantly, but that the Depression had made scarce and precarious. Competition for available work was fierce, with dozens of men appearing each morning hoping to be selected for day labor that paid 60 cents for 10 hours of brutal physical effort. Those not chosen had no income that day, and families went hungry with a frequency that was normal rather than exceptional. Jesus and his father joined the morning lineup seeking work on their second day in California, standing among 40 men competing for 20 positions, picking lemons in groves that stretched across hillsides visible from the camp. The white foreman who made selections walked along the line of men, pointing at those he wanted while ignoring others whose appearance suggested weakness or whose darker skin reflected indigenous heritage that Americans found particularly objectionable. Miguel was chosen because despite his broken spirit, he retained the physical strength of someone who had farmed his entire life. Jesus was initially passed over because of his small size, but when another selected worker failed to appear, the foreman pointed at him with obvious reluctance, saying something in English that Jesus did not understand, but whose contemptuous tone required no translation. They would pick lemons from dawn until dusk, filling crates that weighed more than Jesus himself, earning money that would barely cover food costs and leave nothing for saving toward the better future Miguel promised was possible through hard work. The mockery Jesus experienced began that first day in the lemon groves when he worked alongside white teenagers from families that owned small farms nearby and who were themselves struggling economically but still considered themselves superior to Mexican migrants. During the lunch break, when workers sat in the grove's shade eating whatever food they had brought, Jesus mentioned to another Mexican boy that he intended to work hard, save money, and eventually return to Mexico as a rich man who could buy land and live prosperously. The white teenagers overheard this comment and found it hilarious, their laughter carrying across the grove as they mocked the idea that a Mexican migrant picking fruit for pennies could ever become rich. One of them, a boy named Robert, who was 16 and large for his age, approached Jesus and asked in broken Spanish how long he thought it would take to get rich picking lemons. When Jesus responded seriously that he did not know but would work as long as necessary, Robert's laughter intensified, and he called over his friends to share the joke about the stupid Mexican who thought picking fruit would make him wealthy. The casual cruelty of the white teenagers reflected broader attitudes toward Mexican immigrants throughout Depression-era California, where economic desperation had transformed the racism that always existed into something more violent and openly expressed. Mexicans were blamed for taking jobs that Americans needed, despite the reality that most Americans refused to do agricultural labor even when desperate because they considered it degrading. Mexicans were accused of accepting lower wages and driving down pay for everyone, despite the reality that employers set wages, and Mexicans simply accepted what was offered because starvation was the alternative. Most fundamentally, Mexicans were viewed as temporary workers who would eventually return to Mexico and therefore deserved no investment, no respect, and no consideration beyond their immediate labor value. The idea that a Mexican child might aspire to wealth and success in California was not just unlikely, but offensive to people who believed prosperity was reserved for white Americans and that suggesting otherwise represented uppity behavior requiring suppression. The mockery Jesus experienced was not exceptional meanness, but rather normal expression of attitudes that were widely shared and openly expressed. Jesus's response to the mockery was not anger or defensiveness, but rather a quiet determination that would characterize his entire approach to challenges throughout his life, a psychological resilience that transformed ridicule into motivation rather than allowing it to become discouragement. He did not argue with the white teenagers or defend his aspirations because he understood instinctively that words were worthless and that only results would ever matter. He simply continued working, picking lemons with a focus and intensity that exceeded what the other workers showed, treating each crate as important rather than as just another repetitive task in an endless series. He observed everything around him with attention that went beyond simply performing assigned labor, noting how the foreman evaluated workers, how the groves were organized, which trees produced more fruit, and how the entire operation functioned. He asked questions of older Mexican workers who had been in California longer, learning about crops, seasons, wages at different farms, and which employers were less exploitative than others. He was gathering information and developing understanding that would eventually prove more valuable than immediate earnings. The pattern of Jesus's life over the next 4 years followed the rhythm of California agriculture, as his family moved between crops and regions, never staying long enough to establish roots, but accumulating experiences that built his knowledge of the state's agricultural systems. They picked lemons in Ventura during winter months, moved north to pick strawberries around Oxnard in spring, traveled to the Central Valley for grape harvest in summer, and returned south for citrus season in fall. Each crop required different techniques and offered different insights into agricultural business. Strawberries taught him about crops requiring delicate handling and rapid processing. Grapes showed him how permanent vines created long-term investments rather than annual replanting. Citrus demonstrated the value of crops that could hang on trees for extended periods, allowing flexibility in harvest timing. Throughout these years, Jesus maintained the serious focus that had characterized his first day, saving every penny possible while other workers spent their meager wages on small pleasures that provided temporary relief from brutal conditions. The transformation of California agriculture during the mid-1930s created opportunities that observant workers like Jesus could recognize even when established farmers failed to see them, as Depression-era disruption destroyed old patterns and created space for innovation that would eventually reshape the entire industry. Many farm owners who had operated profitably for decades went bankrupt during the Depression, forced to sell land at drastically reduced prices to whoever had even modest capital. Agricultural extension services began promoting new crops that might provide alternatives to traditional agriculture that had failed so catastrophically. Research stations experimented with varieties imported from other regions, testing whether they could thrive in California's diverse climates. Most significantly, consumer preferences were shifting as Americans who had eaten primarily local foods began seeking variety and novelty that agricultural innovation could provide. Jesus observed these changes with intense interest, understanding that transformation created possibilities that stable times did not offer. The crop that would eventually define Jesus's career first caught his attention in 1936, when he was 18 and working at a ranch near Fallbrook, where the owner had planted several experimental avocado trees as a curiosity rather than a commercial operation. Avocados were not unknown in California. They had been grown in limited quantities since the late 1800s, primarily in home gardens of people familiar with the fruit from Mexico or Central America. But commercial production was minimal because most Americans had never encountered avocados, did not know how to eat them, and found their appearance and texture unusual and unappealing. The few commercial groves that existed served primarily Mexican communities and specialized ethnic markets that paid prices barely justifying production costs. The Fallbrook ranch owner viewed his avocado trees as an interesting experiment that probably would never be profitable, telling Jesus they were Mexican trees for Mexican people and that real agriculture meant growing crops Americans actually wanted to buy. Jesus's recognition that avocados represented extraordinary commercial potential came not from agricultural expertise he did not yet possess, but from intuitive understanding of how crops that seemed unmarketable could become valuable if properly introduced to consumers. He understood that avocados were perfect for California because they required relatively little water compared to other crops, grew well in the coastal climates that characterize much of Southern California, and could be harvested over extended periods rather than requiring processing of entire crops within narrow windows. He knew that Mexican communities would always provide a base market that ensured some demand even if mainstream Americans never adopted the fruit. Most importantly, he believed that American taste preferences were not fixed but could be shaped through education and marketing, and that the fruit's nutritional value and culinary versatility could eventually overcome initial resistance if positioned properly. These insights were remarkable for an 18-year-old with minimal formal education, reflecting a business intelligence that formal schooling had nothing to do with creating. The practical obstacles preventing Jesus from acting on his avocado insights were substantial and reflected the reality that recognizing opportunity and possessing resources to exploit opportunity were entirely different things. He had no land, no significant savings despite years of relentless economy, no access to credit that might allow land purchase, and no legal status that would make American institutions willing to trust him with loans, even if he somehow qualified financially. He was a Mexican migrant worker in a state where Mexican immigrants faced systematic discrimination in every aspect of life, where laws explicitly targeted them for deportation, and where even Mexican Americans who were citizens faced prejudice that limited their opportunities. The idea that he could transition from migrant laborer to farm owner was not just ambitious, but appeared completely unrealistic to anyone who understood the barriers he faced. Yet Jesus began working toward that impossible goal with methodical determination, saving money with even greater discipline, learning everything possible about avocado cultivation, and watching for whatever opening might eventually appear. The opportunity that allowed Jesus to finally begin his transition from worker to owner came in 1938 when a foreclosed property near Escondido came up for sale at a price reflecting its worthlessness in the eyes of conventional agricultural wisdom. The 20-acre parcel had soil that was rocky and poor for traditional crops, was located on a steep hillside that made farming difficult, and had water access that was minimal and unreliable. Previous owners had failed growing conventional crops, and the bank that had foreclosed wanted to recoup anything possible from land they considered nearly valueless. The asking price was $1,800, an amount that Jesus had somehow accumulated through 6 years of the most extreme economy, saving portions of wages that should have been spent on basic needs. He had lived more cheaply than seemed survivable, wearing clothes until they were rags, eating the minimum necessary to maintain working capability, and denying himself every comfort or pleasure. His father thought he was crazy to spend their entire savings on worthless land rather than keeping it as security against future unemployment or emergency. But Jesus understood that the land's perceived worthlessness was exactly what made it accessible, and that its characteristics that deterred others were actually perfect for avocados. The purchase of those 20 acres in 1938 marked the beginning of Jesus's transformation from migrant worker to agricultural entrepreneur, though the first years involved suffering and risk that would have defeated someone less committed to their vision. He continued working as a laborer for other farmers to generate income for living expenses while spending every available hour developing his own property. He planted 300 avocado trees using Fuerte and Hass varieties that research suggested would thrive in Southern California conditions, borrowing money from a Mexican credit cooperative to purchase the young trees. He built the terraces and water management systems the steep hillside required, doing all the work himself because he could not afford hired labor. He constructed a small shack on the property where he lived alone, while his father continued working elsewhere and living in labor camps. His 20 acres consumed every dollar he earned from outside labor, every hour he was not working for wages, and every ounce of energy his body could produce. The mockery he had experienced years earlier continued as other workers and white farmers who noticed his operation laughed at the Mexican trying to grow a crop nobody wanted on land nobody valued. The years from 1938 to 1943 were years of brutal labor and mounting debt, as Jesus's trees grew but produced no income while his expenses continued accumulating. Testing his commitment in ways that revealed whether his vision was genuine insight or simply the delusion his critics believed it to be. Avocado trees required several years to mature before producing fruit commercially, meaning Jesus had to survive financially while his investment generated no returns. He worked 12-hour days for other farmers, then worked on his own property until darkness made further labor impossible. He ate primarily beans and tortillas that cost almost nothing, maintained no social life because he had neither time nor money for it, and lived with privation that made his earlier life as a migrant worker seem comfortable by comparison. His father died in 1941 from injuries suffered in a farming accident, depriving Jesus of the only family he had in California and removing the emotional support that had sustained him. Yet he continued pushing forward with almost inhuman determination, driven by a vision that only he could see and refusing to abandon his investment despite the suffering it required. The first commercial harvest from Jesus's trees in 1943 produced modest quantity but exceptional quality fruit that validated his site selection and cultivation techniques, generating income that was small in absolute terms but enormous in psychological impact because it proved his approach was viable. He harvested over 8,000 pounds of avocados that year, selling them primarily to Mexican markets and specialty ethnic grocers in Los Angeles who paid decent prices for fruit that was superior to anything else available. The income barely covered his operating expenses and debt service, providing no profit and requiring him to continue his outside labor. But it demonstrated that his vision was not delusional fantasy. His trees were healthy, his fruit was excellent, and demand existed even if it was currently limited to ethnic markets. More importantly, he had learned every aspect of avocado cultivation through direct experience, understanding the crop's requirements and characteristics better than agricultural experts who studied avocados theoretically but had never grown them commercially. His knowledge was practical, detailed, and paid for through years of suffering that gave it a validity that academic knowledge lacked. The transformation of Jesus's operation from marginal survival to genuine profitability occurred during the late 1940s as multiple factors converged to create expanding markets for avocados and as his maturing groves reached peak productivity. Post-war prosperity increased American consumer willingness to experiment with new foods that had seemed too exotic during Depression and wartime austerity. California's population exploded as millions moved west, seeking opportunities in the state's booming economy, creating larger markets for agricultural products of all kinds. Mexican-American communities expanded and became more economically powerful, providing growing demand for produce their culture valued. Most significantly, restaurants and food writers began discovering avocados and promoting them to mainstream audiences as sophisticated and healthful rather than as ethnic oddities. Jesus's production increased as his trees matured, reaching 30,000 pounds in 1946, 50,000 in 1947, and exceeding 80,000 by 1949. His income grew proportionally, finally allowing him to pay off debts, accumulate savings, and begin contemplating expansion that would transform his operation from small farm into significant agricultural business. The strategic decision that separated Jesus from other avocado growers and positioned him to dominate the industry was his recognition that success required controlling not just production, but also processing, distribution, and marketing, an integrated approach that small farmers rarely attempted. In 1950, he used his accumulated savings to purchase a packing facility in Escondido that had been used for citrus processing but had become available when its owner retired. He renovated the facility specifically for avocado handling, installing equipment that could wash, sort, pack, and cool the fruit properly. He established relationships with produce distributors in Los Angeles, convincing them that avocados would become profitable if marketed properly to restaurants and upscale grocery stores. Most importantly, he began contracting with other small avocado growers, offering to pack and market their fruit for a percentage of sales, creating a network that gave him control over larger volumes than his own acreage could produce. This vertical integration strategy was sophisticated business thinking that suggested Jesus possessed entrepreneurial intelligence that far exceeded what anyone looking at an uneducated Mexican immigrant would expect. The expansion of Jesus's land holdings through the 1950s accelerated as his growing wealth and demonstrated success allowed him to purchase properties that others still considered marginal, but that he recognized as ideal for avocado cultivation. He bought a 40-acre parcel near Fallbrook in 1952, paying $30,000 for land with the same steep hillsides and poor soil that conventional farmers avoided, but that Jesus understood was perfect for avocados. He acquired another 60 acres near Valley Center in 1954, this property abandoned by owners who had failed growing conventional crops, but whose location and climate Jesus knew would produce exceptional avocados. By 1960, he owned over 200 acres of avocado groves distributed across 3 locations, employed 15 workers full-time, contracted with 40 other growers for packing and distribution, and was generating annual revenues exceeding $300,000. His success was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss, though many established agricultural families continued viewing him as an exception who had gotten lucky rather than as someone whose vision had created an industry they had failed to recognize. The emergence of avocados as a mainstream American food during the 1960s and 1970s created explosive demand growth that transformed the industry from specialty niche into major agricultural sector, and Jesus was positioned better than anyone to capitalize on these trends. California cuisine became fashionable nationally as chefs and food writers promoted fresh produce and innovative preparations that departed from traditional American cooking. Health consciousness increased consumer interest in foods perceived as nutritious, and avocados were marketed as superfoods rich in healthy fats and vitamins. Mexican food evolved from ethnic cuisine into mainstream American dining, with tacos, burritos, and guacamole becoming foods that most Americans ate regularly. The rise of suburban living created demand for backyard avocado trees throughout Southern California, establishing cultural connection between the state and the fruit. Most significantly, avocados became status symbols representing sophisticated taste and healthy lifestyle, transforming them from curiosities into must-have ingredients that restaurants, grocery stores, and home cooks demanded. Production struggled to keep pace with demand growth, creating favorable pricing that made avocado farming extraordinarily profitable for growers who could produce consistent quality at scale. Jesus's response to exploding demand was aggressive expansion that transformed his operation from significant regional player into dominant industry force, controlling substantial percentages of California production. He purchased over 800 acres of additional land during the 1960s, identifying properties throughout San Diego County that had the characteristics he knew avocados required. He established the state's most sophisticated avocado processing facility, investing millions in equipment that could handle vastly larger volumes than his original operation. He pioneered cultivation techniques including high-density planting and advanced irrigation systems that increased yield per acre substantially beyond industry averages. He hired agronomists and developed proprietary methods for managing the diseases and pests that plagued other growers. Most importantly, he established direct relationships with major grocery chains and restaurant suppliers, cutting out intermediaries and capturing larger portions of retail prices. By 1975, his operation controlled approximately 12% of California's avocado production, employed over 200 people, and generated annual revenues exceeding $20 million. The respect and recognition Jesus eventually received from the agricultural community that had once mocked him came slowly and grudgingly, reflecting how difficult Americans found it to acknowledge that a Mexican immigrant possessed business acumen and agricultural expertise exceeding what establishment farmers demonstrated. Industry associations initially excluded him from membership, maintaining informal policies against Mexican participation regardless of business success. Agricultural publications ignored his operation in articles about California avocado production, as if his dominance was somehow illegitimate or unworthy of mention. White farmers who had failed to recognize avocado's potential resented his success rather than acknowledging his superior vision, spreading rumors that he must have used unfair advantages or illegal methods to achieve his position. The cognitive dissonance of needing to acknowledge Jesus's success while maintaining prejudicial beliefs about Mexican inferiority created bizarre rationalizations that attributed his achievement to luck, timing, ethnic connections, or anything except intelligence and hard work. Only gradually did the industry accept that Jesus Ramirez was simply a better farmer and businessman than most people who considered themselves his superiors. The maturity and security Jesus achieved during the 1980s and 1990s allowed him to finally become the generous community supporter and industry leader that his earlier struggles had prevented him from being. He established a foundation that provided scholarships for children of agricultural workers, funding hundreds of young people to attend college and escape the brutal labor that had characterized his youth. He built low-income housing for farm workers in communities near his operations, providing living conditions that were vastly superior to the labor camps where he had started. He funded agricultural research at universities, supporting studies that would improve cultivation techniques and benefit all growers, rather than just his operation. He became a vocal advocate for immigration reform and farm worker rights, using his success and visibility to push for policies that would provide protections and opportunities for people facing the exploitation he had experienced. He hired and promoted based on ability rather than ethnicity, creating one of the most diverse agricultural operations in California and proving that inclusive practices could be both ethical and profitable. His generosity was not public relations strategy, but genuine commitment to helping others who faced barriers he had overcome. The final decades of Jesus's life through the 2000s and 2010s saw him transition from active management to elder statesman role, while the company he built continued growing under leadership of the second generation that shared his vision, if not his personal history of struggle. His children, raised in comfort that he had never known, brought formal education and modern business techniques to operations while maintaining the commitment to quality and innovation that had built the company. The operation expanded to over 4,000 acres, established international export relationships, developed organic and sustainable cultivation methods that addressed environmental concerns, and generated annual revenues exceeding $200 million. Jesus himself became a legendary figure in California agriculture, the embodiment of immigrant success stories that the state celebrated even as it continued treating current immigrants with hostility similar to what he had faced. He received numerous awards and honors, including recognition from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, an honorary doctorate from UC San Diego, an induction into the California Agricultural Hall of Fame. The perspective Jesus gained from decades of success allowed him to reflect on his life's journey with clarity that revealed both the extraordinary nature of his achievement and the randomness of factors that made success possible when similar efforts by others ended in failure. He acknowledged in interviews during his later years that he had been extraordinarily lucky in multiple ways. Lucky to have survived childhood poverty in Mexico. Lucky to have avoided the deportations that destroyed thousands of Mexican families during his youth. Lucky that his father's health had held until Jesus was old enough to survive independently. Lucky that the bank had been willing to sell him land for prices he could afford. And lucky that avocado demand had exploded precisely when his operation was positioned to capitalize on it. He noted that thousands of Mexican workers possessed intelligence and work ethic equal to his own, but had not succeeded because circumstances had not aligned in their favor or because single pieces of bad luck had destroyed their efforts. His success did not prove that America was a land of opportunity where anyone could succeed through hard work, but rather that success required both extraordinary effort and favorable circumstances, and that most people who worked as hard as he had still failed through no fault of their own. The criticism Jesus faced from some Mexican-American activists who argued that his success story was weaponized to justify continued exploitation of farm workers created complicated feelings for him and revealed tensions within immigrant communities about how to interpret individual achievement in contexts of collective struggle. Some activists argued that celebrating exceptional immigrants like Jesus obscured the reality that most farm workers remained poor, despite working as hard as he had, and that his story was used to blame workers for their poverty by suggesting that success was always possible for those who tried hard enough. They noted that Jesus's success had required specific circumstances that no longer existed: cheap land, emerging markets, minimal regulation, and that current farm workers could not replicate his path even if they possessed equal determination. Jesus understood these criticisms and acknowledged their validity while defending his own right to take satisfaction in his achievement and to use his success to help others. He argued that recognizing systemic barriers and celebrating individual success were not mutually exclusive, and that his story should inspire hope while also motivating work to change systems that made success unnecessarily difficult for most people. The death of Jesus Ramirez in 2022 at age 90 generated obituaries and tributes that reflected how completely California had embraced the fruit he had helped popularize and how thoroughly his success had rewritten narratives about Mexican contributions to the state's agricultural dominance. Major newspapers published lengthy profiles describing his journey from mocked migrant child to industry titan who had transformed California agriculture. Industry publications acknowledged that his vision and persistence had created an industry that now generated over $500 million annually in California alone. Political figures from both parties praised him as an immigration success story, though they carefully avoided discussing whether current immigrants would receive the opportunities that had allowed his success. The funeral drew over 2,000 people, including farm workers whose lives he had impacted, business leaders from throughout California agriculture, and politicians who wanted association with a story of triumph that everyone could celebrate. His company announced that operations would continue under family control with commitment to the values and practices he had established. The legacy Jesus Ramirez left extended far beyond his personal wealth and his company's economic impact to include fundamental transformation of California agriculture, immigration narratives, and cultural assumptions about whose knowledge and contributions shaped the state. His success had proven that immigrants brought not just labor, but vision, intelligence, and entrepreneurial drive that created industries rather than simply filling positions in existing structures. His avocado operation had demonstrated that crops dismissed as ethnic curiosities could become mainstream American foods when properly cultivated and marketed, opening possibilities for other specialty crops that are now California staples. His business practices had shown that treating workers fairly and investing in communities could coexist with profitability, refuting arguments that exploitation was necessary for agricultural success. Most fundamentally, his journey from mocked child to respected leader had forced Californians to confront their assumptions about who deserved respect and whose dreams were legitimate, even if that confrontation remained incomplete and ongoing. The dramatic contrast between the mockery Jesus experienced as a 14-year-old child, declaring he would return to Mexico rich, and the reality of dying as one of California's wealthiest and most influential agricultural figures illuminates both the possibility of extraordinary individual achievement and the waste of human potential that prejudice creates. The white children who had mocked him in 1932 could not have imagined that the small Mexican boy picking lemons would eventually employ their grandchildren, shape industries they would work in, and help define California's identity in ways that would outlast them all. Their mockery reflected assumptions about hierarchy and potential that were completely wrong. But that felt self-evidently true to people who could not see past surface characteristics to recognize capability. The fact that Jesus succeeded despite their mockery was not primarily about proving them wrong. He was too focused on survival and achievement to waste energy on revenge, but about demonstrating that the limitations others tried to impose were not real constraints, but rather reflections of the imposer's own inadequacy. He did not go back rich to Mexico as he had once declared, because California became his home in ways he could not have predicted, and because the wealth he created was too large to be measured simply in money, but included industries, opportunities, and possibilities that had not existed before he built them. The story of Jesus Ramirez is ultimately about the distance between who people appear to be in moments of vulnerability and who they can become when determination combines with opportunity, and about how completely prejudice blinds people to the potential in those they dismiss. It is about how the mockery of ignorant children and the discrimination of prejudiced adults could not prevent achievement when vision was clear and commitment was absolute, though it made the journey more difficult than it needed to be. It is about how crops and industries emerge not from institutional wisdom, but from individuals who see possibilities that experts miss and who persist despite widespread belief that their visions are foolish. Most fundamentally, it is about how immigrant stories that Americans love to celebrate in retrospect involve suffering that current policy deliberately inflicts, creating false choice between maintaining systems that make success extraordinarily difficult and celebrating the exceptional few who succeed despite those systems. The boy they mocked died as California's avocado king, his success so complete that it forced recognition from people who had never wanted to respect him, proving that determination and intelligence could overcome almost anything, while also revealing how many others with equal determination never received the chances that would have allowed them to demonstrate what they were capable of achieving.